like to welcome you this evening to the First Unitarian Church, the Church of the River. I'm the Reverend Burton Carley, the minister of this congregation. We are pleased to present this evening the last of three programs titled A Memphis Retrospective, the African American Legacy. Through the personal experiences and thoughtful perspectives of our speakers, we have been examining the civil rights movement in America and what it teaches us about race relations in Memphis and our nation. Our speakers in the series have included Dr. Benjamin Hooks, Mrs. Johnny Turner, and tonight Mr. Ron Walter. This program is an effort of the lead committee of our congregation. It is an interracial committee, and its task is to help lead our community in appreciating diversity and perhaps in helping us in some small way to be a bridge in Memphis to racial reconciliation. It does indeed give me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Ron Walter, the Executive Vice President and Station Manager at WREG Channel 3, right next door to us. We're always are very gracious to Mr. Walter for many reasons. One among them is that he allows us to park our cars there on Sunday. We really appreciate his neighborliness toward us. Mr. Walter is a graduate of Clark University and Case Western Reserve University. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of Second Congregational Church and has served or is serving on many educational and service organizational boards in our city. From 81 to 85, he was a columnist at the Commercial Appeal, and he is well known for co-authoring the 19th Century Memphis Families of Color 1850 to 1900. He also authored WREG TV's chapters in Memphis Black History and edited and produced 6 oral history tapes in 1976 of pioneering Black Memphians. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Mr. Ron Walter.
Thank you, Reverend Carley. It's nothing like being made very humble when you come into a building and one of your friends from 22 years ago tells you that, oh, you've matured quite a bit since I've seen you last. Catherine Embry and I worked together at the public library back then. We were in the trenches, so of course I was a child and she was a child, so what can you say? I'm delighted to be here. You know, Congregationalism is a branch of the Unitarianism. You broke off from us because we were a little bit too conservative from you. Most people don't understand either one of us. The congregation, particularly in this part of the country, they ask me what church I attend. I say Second Congregational. They say, is that part of the United States Congress? I say, oh, no. Quite different from that. So it's unknown, and I'm sure you get the same response when people ask you what church you attend. I'm probably going to be your shortest speaker of the series. I know you want to, you're probably tired after having heard 2 very eloquent speakers, so you'll hear one that's not so eloquent tonight, but I'm going to tell you some, my topic is going to center around the early days of Memphis. I'm going to talk about the 5, what I consider the 5 developments of Black Memphis. The first period being the late 1800s to 1905 to the 1930s, the 30s through the 50s, late 50s through 74 through 91, and 91 to present. I have definite ideas as to why these are distinct periods, and I will talk about that as we go along. As you know, the first period I'm talking about is the Reconstruction era, the period after the Civil War to 1905. That was the development of the very earliest Black social, political, educational, and cultural institutions in this area. Black males had the right to vote in Memphis as early as 1867 and to hold public office. And indeed they did. Among the very earliest elected Black and appointed officials were people like Limas Wallace, He operated a saloon on Beale Street. He was a member of what they call the Legislative Council, the predecessor of the today City Council. He was the first black to serve. He was a member of the Memphis Board of Education. He had a very, very strong temper. The commercial appeal in May 15th, 1886 noted that he decked out a man for insulting him. He paid his fine and was released from jail and went on decking out others as they insulted him. Ed Shaw. Ed Shaw was a political boss of sorts. He was the wharf master. That was the highest salaried governmental position in the Memphis area in the 1870s. He was free. He was a free man. In 1852, he was the first black candidate to run for Congress in the Shelby County, in the Memphis area, in 1870. He was also one of the earliest blacks to serve on the county commission, and in 1873 he was elected to the city council. In the 1870s, he severely criticized the Republicans for not including blacks in top roles. As you know, most blacks back during that era were associated with the Republican Party. Most people today find that quite interesting, since it's quite the opposite today. He was among, though, the blacks and whites who escorted U.S. General Grant when he visited Memphis in 1880 to the campus of Lemoyne Normal Institute, as it was called back then. So he was a very civic-minded and very busy individual who certainly had a lot of distinction in this community. A couple of others I'm going to talk about very quickly. I.F. Norris, he was a grocer and he was in the grocery and coal and wood business. He was elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives in the 1880s as a Republican. Thomas F. Cassells, he was probably the second black lawyer in the community. Many feel that he was the first trained lawyer by education, black lawyer. He settled in Memphis in the 1870s and served as collector of port for the city of Memphis. Green Evans and William Fields also were elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives back during that era. As I indicated, Shaw got into a lot of squabbles with these with the Republicans because of the fact that they didn't allow blacks to have a lot of power and say in what was going on in the city at the time. And it was unusual for blacks to be anything other than associated with the Republican Party, because the Democratic Party back then was known as, quote, the white man's party. Fred Hunt was another distinguished person who served the government quite well. He was recorder of deeds and he was the county register. Hunt, he was a descendant of one of the most prominent black families in the Memphis area. He was from what they call Huntsville, Alabama, perhaps named for some branch of his family, the white branch perhaps. He belonged to the Hunts whose descendants operate the Hunt Phelan home today. And one of his grandsons was Blair T. Hunt, and Blair T. Hunt was a person I interviewed for an oral history interview for the Memphis Public Library way back during the Bicentennial Commission in 1976 with Mrs. Embry back there. And let me just read to you something that Blair Hunt told me, which stuck with me for a long time. He talked about his mother when she arrived, how she arrived in this area. His mother came from Danville, Kentucky. Her owner was a man by the name of Mr. Souse. He said he was a Jew. He was trying to get them from Kentucky down to Louisiana because the slaves were about to be freed in Kentucky. He thought if he could go down to Louisiana, he could keep his slaves. The way his mother told him, she was about 5 years old, and she said she remembered very well that Mr. Souse came and said to her mother when they docked here in Memphis, "Well, Ann, you and them are free now. They were just left here on the riverfront in Memphis like little animals." He said, young people, they had nothing to do, no place to go, but they made a life for themselves and provided well for the children, and consequently there were a number of people in the Hunt family who achieved an awful lot in this community. Fred Savage, he was a member of the Board of Education. He was a highly skilled shoemaker. He was the first black to serve the board in 1885. J.T. Settle, he was what they called a decided mulatto. He served as Attorney General Pro Tem of the Criminal Court of Shelby County. He was educated at Oberlin College in 1868 and later Howard Law School. He argued segregation cases before the United States Supreme Court. He was really quite a distinguished lawyer in this community. Blacks were also employed as police officers during this period, as early as 1878. They beat such eastern cities as Philadelphia as having blacks on the police force. I remember hearing all the hoopla about the first black police officers in Memphis coming along during the 1940s era. And once when I had written an article for the Commercial Appeal talking about blacks who were serving in the 1800s, a couple of them called me and one even threatened me to say that I don't believe what you're saying and you shouldn't be spreading things like this when we have proclaimed and people have believed us for recent history that we're among the first to serve the police force. It was untrue. There are many documents to support, not many, but there's some very well-written documents that talk about early black police officers in Memphis who served the city quite well, and there are reasons for their service and the reasons for their being in existence. Memphis was not very open to blacks serving on the police force, needless to say. Mayor Logue, during 1873, pushed very hard to get blacks on the police force, but Memphis, being the traditional city that it was, did not see fit for that to happen. But in 1878, something very significant was going on in the city. We were victims of the yellow fever epidemics, the great 1878 and 1879 epidemics. And blacks had some sort of immunity to the yellow fever epidemic, the yellow fever itself. They didn't die as quickly. That's one good thing back then about being black. They didn't die as quickly as whites did from being bitten by the mosquito that carried the disease. So Memphis lost many of its white citizens through death as well as through people leaving who could get out of town. And consequently, there were many houses, many facilities that were left vacant, and there was lawlessness going on in the city. So they had to get some police officers from someplace. So presto, they got the ones who were living, the black guys, trained them, and they were written up in national media as being very outstanding police officers. Lamorne Normal Institute was one of the early institutions founded during the early days in Memphis in the 1800s. It was founded by the American Missionary Association, that's called the AMA. It was probably the most important educational institution in the area because of the fact that it was the only high school, secondary school in the city to educate blacks. It was one reason why Memphis had what many considered a highly educated black population during that era because of the fact that Lamorne provided that fine education for them. Howe Institute was a school that followed Lamorne in 1882. It was founded by the Black Baptists. It was basically a religious training institution. One of its most famous leaders was Dr. T.O. Fuller. He was a former senator from North Carolina, and he's the person for whom Fuller State Park is named. Fuller was also pastor of First Baptist Church, which split from the historic Beale Street Baptist Church. He was quite an author back then. It's hard to publish a book today, but it must have been even more difficult to publish back then. He wrote several books, including The Pictorial History of the American Negro, History of the Negro Baptists in Tennessee, The Story of Church Life Among Negroes in Memphis. So his works are there for many people to study and learn more about blacks in Memphis during that earlier period. The Hooks Conservatory of Music on Beale Street, founded by Julia Hooks, the grandmother of your first speaker, Ben Hooks, was one of the fine music institutions in Memphis during the early days. Among her prominent students were Sidney Woodward, one of the first black concert artists to tour Europe, and Nell Hunter, who starred in the Broadway hit Green Pastures. Mrs. Hooks initiated the founding of the Old Folks and Orphans Home, and she was an officer of the juvenile court back during the early days in Memphis. Let me just quickly talk about some of the other early institutions. I said I wasn't going to be long. I've already been up 20 minutes. Roger Williams College, which later merged with Howe, the University of West Tennessee School. There was a reason why that the University of West Tennessee was a school that trained many people for medicine, dentistry, and law, and that was the reason why there were so many doctors and lawyers in Memphis during that period. Zion Cemetery, which is the oldest black cemetery, and it was always advertised that the best classes of blacks patronize that cemetery. It's located on South Parkway East near Pillow Street, in the heart of the black community today, but back then that was kind of rural. One of the most important black people to emerge during this early period, though, was a man by the name of Robert R. Church Sr., the South's first black millionaire. Church invested heavily in real estate. He owned and operated a hotel. He owned and operated a saloon. He built and lived in a magnificent Queen Anne mansion on Lauderdale, and could count among his neighbors Senator McKellar, the Postmaster General of Memphis, and a number of wealthy merchants of the city. He started the Solvent Savings Bank and Trust Company in 1906, and he was a recognized philanthropist in this city. His best-known civic act was his contribution of $1,000 to buy a bond. Memphis, as you know, lost its charter. It went bankrupt during the yellow fever epidemic. It could not support itself. And the person who told this story better than anybody, it was Catherine Embry. When the little kids would come to the library, she showed them on the map all about Memphis and would tell them about the city losing its charter during that period. But Church was the first citizen, black or white, to come forward. There were no other blacks, but he was the first citizen to come forward to buy a bond to help the city regain its financial solvency. Other very important men and women of the 19th century included Dave Washington. He was Memphis's first black postman. He was appointed in 1874 and became one of the richest black people in Memphis. At his death during the Great Depression, when everybody was losing money, he was valued at nearly $500 million. And he was touted in the New York Times as being the richest postman in America, black or white. He amassed his money by being like people do it today, saving dollar for dollar, investing wisely back then in real estate. He was one of the few, he was the only black person to own real estate on Main Street during that period. G.P. Hamilton was a graduate of Lemoore Normal Institute with honors, and he was the first black to organize a marching high school band in the city. He was a great author. He wrote the book, The Bright Side of Memphis and The Beacon Lights of the Race. Those books serve as the foundation of many other researchers to learn about the professions that many black people had during the early periods in Memphis. Bishop C.E. Mason, who founded the Church of God in Christ right here in Memphis in 1902. Ida B. Wells was an imposing woman whose life is richly embedded in the foundation of the city. She published and edited a black weekly newspaper in 1892 called the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. Her biting editorials so angered, she wrote editorials about the racial injustices in the city and the lynchings that occurred around here. She wrote under the pen name of Iola. One of her stories about the lynching that occurred of a successful black businessman. They claimed that he raped somebody. She indicated that it was not rape. He was just a successful pharmacist, and the white pharmacist down the road didn't like his competition, so he got rid of him that way by using the charge of rape. But she wrote about this, and her editorial was so biting that the white capitalists in the city had decreed that they were going to take her to Court Square, tie her up, and beat her to death with her own typewriter. Well, she heard about this alleged punishment, and she left the city under the sponsorship of the editor of the New York Age, where she went around the world to talk about lynchings in the South and racial injustices that occurred. Phil Nicholson was an important guy. who lived in Memphis during this period. He organized, he was a truck farmer who had over 360 acres of land. He sold his goods at the Beale Street Market, one of the few blacks to hold a market there. His children became very successful pharmacists. His daughter married the first black pharmacist in the city, and she also became a degreed pharmacist. Her husband, George Jackson, got his degree from Oberlin College, and during the time I was doing research on him and getting a Tennessee Historical Commission marker erected for him on Beale Street at the site where his office was located, I wrote Oberlin College to get information on him, and they were very pleased because at the same time they were doing a centennial celebration and wanted to feature him as their first black pharmacist. So we were all together. I was glad we were on the same page at the same time, and we were all right. Joseph Plouston was an antebellum freedman who allegedly owned over 100 slaves. He operated a grocery store, barbershop, and held a city council seat in 1873. Even blacks got into the slavery business, a few of them, not many, but it was probably a means of business as he saw it, and he was probably a benevolent slave owner, I would think. George and John Love, who was the founder of the Mail Carriers Orchestra. He was a postman also who amassed a great deal of wealth during that period. At his death, also during the Great Depression, he left over $100,000 to charity, to the Crippled Children's Hospital, the YMCA, and his church, Second Congregational Church. He was also written up in national magazines. People couldn't figure out how these postmen got all this money, but they were into real estate and saving their money and being very frugal. B.K. Sampson was appointed the first assistant superintendent of the Memphis City Schools in 1875, overseeing the black schools. Some interesting points, let me just summarize this period. Interesting points about this period. The yellow fever epidemics of 1878 and 1879, and before that, 1873, wiped out so many whites that blacks enjoyed somewhat of a majority at one point. The population suffered 7,000 deaths and over 19,000 non-fatal attacks of the disease. In Memphis, there were nearly 100 deaths a day from the yellow fever epidemic, and the population of 40,000 dropped drastically. But blacks remained here, and much of the development of the city was done by the blacks who lived in the city during that period. There was a $2 poll tax that kept many blacks from voting. And so you did have a black electorate as a majority, but because of the poll tax, not all people registered to vote and not all people voted. So that explained why blacks didn't just really take over the city from a political point of view. Some people think blacks are taking over the city now from an unpolitical point of view. But things go in cycles, I guess. President Theodore Roosevelt came to Memphis in November 1902 and spoke to over 10,000 black people at Churches Park on Beale Street. He came at the invitation of blacks and rode into the park on his horses with his horsemen. They said it was quite a dramatic sight to see them all parading around, and blacks were jammed into the auditorium just to hear him speak. And there were rich accounts of it written up in the commercial appeal, how flowers draped everything and bunting was everywhere. And the president left here saying that this was a very cultured city for blacks and whites. Booker T. Washington also came to Memphis during this period, and there were black police officers, as I mentioned earlier. Census information categorized people as black, mulatto, or white. So there was some distinction there which does not exist today. Several race riots occurred, including one in 1866, right on this grounds where we were standing at Fort Pickering, and in 1892 and 1893. The 1890s riots caused a great exodus of blacks from this area into Oklahoma, Bowlegs, Oklahoma, where they had some free land that the government provided. There were so many lynchings in Memphis back then that Memphis developed an international reputation for white barbarity. So things were not that good for black people in Memphis during that early period. The phase two I'm going to talk about is slightly after the turn of the century to the 1930s. 1905. July 5th, 1905 is an important date because it signaled the start of the Jim Crow era in Memphis. Jim Crow, it referred to the name of a black character in the song, but Jim Crow, as you know, was the systematic practice of segregation and suppression of blacks. It also was, during this period, was the emergence of the following people and institutions who made a very strong impact on the city. The Crump Machine, he was first elected to mayor in 1909. He was a major powerhouse in this community. His power has probably not been matched. Robert R. Church Jr., the Memphis Red Sox, a professional black baseball team, played here, and that exhibit is now at the Memphis Pink Palace Museum. The Lincoln Republican League emerged here in 1916. The NAACP in 1918 started. The Tri-State Fair, the black version of the Mid-South Fair, started in 1910. Lucy Campbell, the great songwriter, gospel songwriter, who was one of the organizers of the National Baptist Convention, was a person who was here. Dr. J.B. Martin, who was one of the people who fought the Crump Machine. Universal Life Insurance was started here September 23rd of 1923. George Lee became a figure to be reckoned with, and some other black social institutions emerged, including the Primrose Club, which was a highfalutin social organization of young men about town. Fred Hutchins, who was a postman, was a member of that. Fred Hutchins was a remarkable historian and a genteel individual who used to have this wonderful Christmas party every year where he served this huge bowl of eggnog that was so heavily spiked that if you took a drink of it, you were knocked out. But he wrote all these wonderful stories about the city of Memphis, and his book, too, is an important one to be a part of. But he told me about the Primrose Club and how membership was so selective there that a man couldn't drink or smoke or be a part of the Primrose Club. And I said, well, it was in the 70s when he told me that. I said, you wouldn't have any members today because everybody drinks and smokes in this city. Mordecai Johnson, who was the first black president of Howard University, was a member of this organization. He was the butler for the M.E. Carters on Central Avenue, and he earned his PhD from Columbia University. Let me talk about the Crump Machine a little bit and how it was viewed in Memphis and the effects that it had on blacks. When Crump took office, there were drunks in every gutter. There were 600 saloons, 6 times as many saloons there were in the city as there were schools. Prostitutes of all shapes, sizes, and colors were everywhere in this community. Some people feel that the Crump Machine was largely built on the black vote. The people who were not as well educated, the blacks who were not as well educated, generally liked who they called Mr. Crump. He gave them watermelons, free picnics, free boat rides. He walked their streets with his recognizable strut on the bells of his feet, with his knees slightly flexed. He rode the buses. He was a colorful dresser. He ran efficient government, something that was dreadfully needed in this community at the time. Some researchers have said that all of this public facade that he had obscured his dictatorial manner. The better educated upper-class blacks generally had some reservations about Mr. Crump, and that's a conservative statement. He controlled their jobs. Many of them were teachers. I was told that when you went to vote, if you said you were a city school teacher, he had a lieutenant to look under the voting booth to see how you were voting. If you didn't vote the right way, the right ticket, you didn't have a job the next day. It has been alleged that he ruined people who disagreed with him. One who challenged Crump was Robert R. Church Jr. Church Jr. was the son of Church Sr. In 1916, he organized the Lincoln Republican League on Bill Street, which grew to be a national political organization. Among those associated with him were people like Bert Roddy, T.H. Hayes, who founded the Hayes and Son Funeral Home, and J.T. Settle, who I talked about earlier, who was an assistant attorney general pro tem of Shelby County Court here. In 1912, at the age of 26, He attended his first Republican convention and continued until his death in 1952. He was at his peak of power during the 20s and 30s. His black and tan wing of the Republican Party was in power in Shelby County, and the lily white Republicans had to follow Church's lead. Church had much of the patronage power with the government during that period. He lost his power when the Republicans were booted out of office, and the Democrats started making their strong inroads in. Church was one of the original founders of the original Memphis chapter of the NAACP in 1918, along with 53 other people, including 3 women. You know, back then, women weren't allowed to do very much of anything, and to join a group that was as radical back then as the NAACP was quite something. Church began with his decline, as I said, when the Roosevelt administration took office. He left Memphis after he had his major disagreement with Trump and did not return until he was dead. George Lee then later became the Republican power broker, chief of the Republican Party, when Church had his decline. The early days of the NAACP the early days were quite dangerous. Their activities centered around actions to end lynchings and poll taxes. They also challenged the railroads for unequal pay for the same work for the black coachmen. There's been a very scholarly work that was written up in one of the Tennessee historical papers about the black coachmen and the efforts of the NAACP during that period. They had to use codes, though, when communicating with the Washington office about the activities going on in the Memphis area. For example, they used things like purchase Memphis for a man lynched in Memphis, 1,500 by a mob of 1,500 people. Cash was used for the terminology charge of rape, and Fred was the code word for the KKK. And Fred was used an awful lot during that period because the KKK was quite active. An interesting point about the period, in 1916, Memphis had another reputation, and it was the city of Negro wealth, boasting high home ownership and a good number of educated black citizens. So there were some things that occurred in Memphis during that time which were not all bad. The next phase I'm going to talk about is the 30s through the 50s. That was the period where you had people like Dr. Joseph Edison Walker coming into existence, the Tri-State Bank in 1946, the Negro Chamber of Commerce in 1926, and the emergence of the present-day black society, and I'm talking about society with a capital S, groups like the Lynx, the Jack and Jill, the Boulay, and came into existence during that period. Also, we had financial institutions becoming strong here. You had Mutual Federal Savings and Loan, the first of its kind and the only of its kind came into existence. Matthew Thornton was a colorful figure who was around in that period. He was declared the mayor of Beale Street in 1938 by the Memphis World newspaper. It was a contest. He was a barber and a policeman under one of the first in that series of black policemen under Chief Appy. He managed, his mayoral victory was written up in the New York Times, and I have that clip in my clipping file because they talked about what a good job he had done in getting people throughout the city, blacks and whites, to vote for him through the Memphis World as the mayor of Beale Street. Dr. Walker, who founded Universal Life Insurance Company, moved to Memphis in 1920 from Indianola, Mississippi. In Mississippi, he was the president of the Delta Penny Savings Bank. He was also the president of the Mississippi Life Insurance Company. He started the Community Welfare League in 1932, which later became the Urban League. Universal Life in 1923. He helped finance the development of the Walker Homes, a black subdivision, and organized resistance. He also fought the Crump machine, opposing Trump's candidates for Congress. He was one of the blacks who ran. There was a big gap in Memphis history where there were no blacks running for public office until that period. Roberta Church renewed that effort when she ran for the seat that her father gave up when he died for the Republican Executive Committee, and he ran for the school board during that period also. So blacks started getting back involved in politics. We have the organization of the Negro Chamber of Commerce, the Shelby County Democratic Club, which splintered off into the Voters Council, entertainment black spots like Top Hats and Tails Club, which was located on South Parkway, which went out of existence about 5 years ago. Lumpkin Hotel at Vance and Orleans was a popular spot. Wheeler Walker Clubhouse, which was founded by the Walkers, was a popular spot on Walker Avenue. Tony's was a place where people went to party, and Bessie's Chicken Shack and the Hippodrome. All of these institutions were popular places where blacks visited back then. Also during this period in 1948, at least 8 black police officers were hired by the city. And I'm going to go through the next couple of phases fairly quickly because I said I was going to speak for 30 minutes. I'm now up to 45 minutes almost. Phases 4 was 1950s through 74. We had the emergence of the young black leaders. They were young then, people like J.O. Patterson, Russell Sugarman, the late A.W. Willis, Ben Hooks, Maxine Smith, and the late Jesse Turner, late Hollis Price, and A. Mesa Walker. They were young guys and gals who were very active into the political and business process. People like Hollis Price was very, very unique. He came to Memphis in 1941 as the dean of Lemoyne College. He was from Cassahopic, I can never say that word correctly, Virginia. He was the son of a principal of an American Missionary Association high school. His parents were well educated, and he was well educated. He was the first black president of Lemoyne. He was what they called a bridge builder back then. When he died in 1982, I think it was, editorials in both the Commercial Repeal and Press Scimitar were very complimentary of how he worked among races and among classes of people to bring people together. He was the first black elected to the highest lay position in the Congregational Church national body when he was elected the moderator of the church back in the 60s. That was quite an accomplishment even for the Congregationalists who considered themselves quite liberal. Others involved during this period include Russell Sugarman, who ran for the city commission in 1954. Of course, we know he lost. People like Otis Higgs emerged as a state judge, and in 1960, the city hired 12 more police officers. So we're beginning to see more blacks into public officials. I think perhaps the most influential person to emerge in this period was Maxine Smith, who was is and was a courageous, and I'm sorry she didn't speak to you last week, person who fought anything and everybody who she felt was in the way of justice. She often wondered why nobody loved her. She said that she felt so unloved in this city, and people started doing little things like "We love you, Maxine," as a result. The next phase, phase 5, is the development of true power in the city, where we had the election of Harold Ford to Congress. He eclipsed everybody else's power because his was truly elected power. And he had people behind him, office behind him, and everything else going for him. I remember when he was running the first time and his brother John was running for city council. And John was and still is a bit more radical than Harold is, and was going about cursing out people back then and making headlines. And one person he chose to curse out was a very patrician white lady in the city by the name of Gwen Awesome. While he was on city council, he was talking, having the floor, and she interrupted him. He didn't like to be interrupted. He said, "Go to hell, Gwen Awesome." It made headlines. It was captured on TV. newspapers. I mean, the TV, they heard him say, "Go to hell, Gwen Austin." Well, Harold Ford didn't want any association with that because in the black community, in the white community, people can tell them apart. They didn't know Harold from John, so he didn't want to be viewed as this radical. In the black community, they were rejoicing. You know, for years and years, blacks were put in their place. Finally, we have a man in public to put somebody, not only somebody who was really somebody in their place. So it was really quite something. And as a result of that, Harold Ford got, the energy of the black community was so great that they went out in great numbers to vote for him, and he was elected to Congress. I think the Ford power structure will go down in Memphis history as being quite a very powerful organization. I've never seen anything like it in my life. He doesn't have a machine in the traditional sense of a machine. And I must give you a disclaimer. I did work for him, so I might be a cog in the machine, so to speak, at one point. You know, he didn't have any sophisticated warded precinct organization. He just went to communities in what he called back then parades. He would march up and down streets, and we would bang on drums and huge caravans of cars, beeping horns, and people would come out looking and saying, "I'm going to vote for you. I'm going to be with you." And he did basically the same thing when he declared that his son was going to take his role, and he did get it. Now, many people didn't think that was going to happen. But never underestimate the Ford machine, because they can produce a Ford for whatever office they want, it seems. I think this phase is going to continue for a bit. I guess I was up for grabs as thinking about Dr. Harrington, who's a fine politician. I wouldn't say a politician. He's a government official. He's not a politician like Harold Ford is, but he doesn't have the same political skill as the Ford machine. So his power base will never be as strong as the Ford's base. On that note, which was a little controversial, I will end and open up to any questions you might have.